Hey everybody, Jack Dallas here. It's been a little while since I made a video, and I just wanted to explain real quick that about 90% of the reason for that is because I'm going to be making a move on August 1st, and I've been extremely busy getting things ready to make this move, so I just haven't really had time to make a proper video. Now, a lot of you know I've been interested in the topic of the U.S. opening up diplomatic relations with Cuba once again. It's been decades since that has been something that the U.S. has been allowed to do, and I want to discuss the potential actual motivations for why that is occurring. You'll see I have a lot of articles here. I'm going to go through them kind of quickly, and I'm going to post them all in the info on the video so you guys can check them out on your own. But I just want to talk about mainly, I think, a lot of this, the reason behind why these diplomatic relations are opening has to do with agriculture and the agricultural lobby, guys. Most of you are smart enough to know that when you hear Obama talking about the need to open up diplomatic relations because it's been decades, it's a quote unquote failed policy. These are all lies. Of course, the U.S.'s stance towards Cuba is ridiculous, but Obama is not about trying to do things because they are right or because they may be more fair to the Cuban people. This is about making more money for the people that put him in office and who are going to put his successor, Hillary Clinton, in office. So let's talk about it. Real quick, I just wanted to point this out, guys. I wrote about this topic a while back on the old blog before I started doing videos. You'll see the first article I wrote was called Cuba and the New Development Bank, and basically in this article I suggested that essentially the New Development Bank, which is the bank that is being sort of put together by the East. It's like the Eastern reaction to groups like the IMF and things like that. Might be trying to sort of gobble up Cuba in a way, do things like offer them aid money in exchange for political favors. The U.S. does stuff like this all the time. A great example would be the U.S. doing this in the 80s in Latin America, instilling dictators that are sympathetic to their policy and essentially providing money in exchange for future political favors and exclusive contracts for U.S. companies. Companies like United Fruit essentially became successful due to deals like this, so you want to check that out on your own a little bit. I also wrote about that exact topic right here. Will Cuba be the next victim of a U.S. foreign aid swindle? This is where I talked about different groups like the IMF and USAID and how they take advantage of countries where they supposedly go in to help. I talked about Latin America here, and I compared it to what potentially would be happening in Cuba. So if you want some background on why I was suspicious of this whole deal to begin with, you might want to check out those articles. Now, of all the articles that I've checked out, this one in the Boston Globe, I have to say, is surprisingly excellent about the Cuban topic. So what it goes into here is a lot about Cuba's organic farms that they have going on. You can see they call them here the Organopanico. Okay, so basically a network of organic farms. You can see in the article they talk about Cuba having shortages of food, shortages of fuel. This is all true, but the problem is it's being used as motivation for U.S. companies to come in, essentially at the discretion of the U.S. government to basically extort the Cuban people, just like Latin America in the 1980s again. So what's interesting is if you come down to the second half of the article, the whole thing starts to unravel here. So you can see it's talking about the Cuban food trade up here. The U.S. exported to Cuba nearly $400 million worth of agricultural products under exemptions to the trade embargo approved by Congress in 2000. So we had that lifted in the year 2000. After that, you can see U.S. companies making their move in. So here's where it gets interesting, okay? Now, it says here the new rules no longer require U.S. agriculture companies licensed to sell to Cuba to route transactions through banks based in other countries or to get paid in cash up front. So it's talking here about how close Cuba is. They can export all these different things, import things they need. And this brings up a really good point, guys. Right now, the U.S. economy is essentially getting ready to take another huge drop. A lot of this is going to be tied into Fed policy. It's going to be tied into the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. But currently, the US has a very strong currency. The dollar is strong. And part of what happens when a currency is strong, in this case specifically the dollar, is it does tend to hurt exports because the currency is highly valued. So opening up another potential avenue for exports, another customer, helps to offset that high dollar, which will hurt exports, during that time period. So adding Cuba as sort of a client state would be beneficial to U.S. companies that have their exports being hurt. Of course, anybody who's exporting a lot of agricultural products is going to feel that strong dollar hurting their exports specifically. So those lobbyists would be the ones who want to come in. And since Cuba has food issues, it's just a perfect storm for lobbyists to come in and just rape the shit out of the country. So essentially, you'll see right here. Here's where the whole thing comes down to right this right here. The industry's lobbying effort geared up rapidly after Obama's announcement. Companies organized a new trade group, the U.S. Agriculture Coalition for Cuba. There's something to Google, guys. Why not just Google that? Which boasts some 30 members and is co-chaired by an executive from Cargill. We're going to get into more of that. One of the largest U.S. food and agricultural conglomerates. So here we have a bullshit lobbyist group which is coming in to Cuba, which is being headed once again by a U.S. corporation who is taking their own profits and donating them to political lobbying campaigns, which resulted in this embargo being dropped in the first place. So you can kind of see how the whole thing is being set up to be advantageous to nobody but the corporations who have the money to donate to the politicians. This isn't about the Cuban people. This isn't about the American people. It's about the politicians setting themselves up to get donations from lobbyists who are representing agricultural corporations in America. That's it. This article was excellent. So what a perfect segue, guys. After that, we move on to the Star Tribune here, where we have an article exclusively about Cargill. Now, if you just Google Cargill and Cuba or something, related to that, you're going to find a ton. Cargill seemed to be a company that came up for me time and time again when I was researching this topic. So essentially, this company has decided to take the lead role in efforts to open up diplomatic relations with Cuba. A lot of you might have also already thought about a company like Monsanto wanting to take a lead role in this. That's definitely going to happen. But Cargill seems to want to be front and center in this whole debate. So you can check out this article about it. Essentially, you'll see that they're putting a ton of money into this, and they have been for years and years and years, okay? You can see this little paragraph down here. The Cuban market of 11 million people seems minuscule for Cargill, which grows to nearly $135 billion in sales in 2014. That seems dubious without some government intervention. Since it began selling in Cuba in 2002, remember there was that slight lifting of the embargo in 2000, Cargill has sold barely 1 million metric tons of agricultural products and vegetable oil. Now, wouldn't that be enough motivation to want to further open these trade restrictions, especially with a strong dollar hurting exports? It seems like, once again, guys, the motivations are very cut and very dry and just extremely clear to see. So even they call Cuba a natural market for American agricultural producers and distributors. So you can see some more facts and figures about all that right in here. Essentially, like I said, I think that the strong dollar and Fed policy is going to be driving a lot of the what I'll call like the time motivations towards trying to open up these relations. In other words, this is a time-sensitive movement. If the strong dollar is allowed to continue and these companies aren't doing anything to try to offset their hurt exports, obviously that's going to kill their bottom line. So this is like an extra motivation for them to hurry up. Now, obviously, you can't just go from the year 2000, where there's a slight opening up of economic relations, to 2015, where we're trying to open up full-blown diplomatic relations. There's a lot of lobbying that has to go on. There's a lot of backdoor deals. There's a lot of bullshit donations. There's a lot of, sort of under-the-table exchanges of money that have to go on. A lot of corruption has to happen behind the scenes first. So this is just the result of all that political maneuvering. But I definitely think the strong dollar and exports being hurt is motivating this to a large extent. So the next article here from Reuters. Obviously, no surprise. If you have agricultural lobbyists, if you have government intervention, if you have a ton of money being put into opening up diplomatic relations in a new country, you are going to need lawyers. Am I right, guys? And the lawyers get paid no matter what. You win, you lose, as long as lawsuits are happening, as long as money is changing hands, the lawyers are winning. So we can see here, we've already got law firms who represent Fortune 100 companies. And essentially, they want to come in, they want to make sure that no matter what, if the lawsuits are happening, if the money is flying, they are ready. They want to set up offices down there, they want to have representatives down there, they want to have people who can essentially represent the future needs of U.S. law firms. So you can tell a couple things. One, if law firms are moving into Cuba, that means they know they can turn a profit, and that means that these U.S. companies are moving forward no matter what. This is just another indication of that. The second thing it points out is the fact that we know that they expect to have difficulties in terms of legal difficulties, financial difficulties. So the law firms have to move in future anticipation of difficulties with U.S. corporations. Of course, we know that they'll win no matter what. They have the most money. They'll tie Cuba up with their money. It does not matter. So you can see here, it actually, one of the lawyers who was interviewed essentially said that if you don't have a Cuban strategy, you are essentially going to be behind in the game here. So this Cuba thing is something that's been going on for years and years and years behind the back of the American people. And guys, this is one where it's just so obvious. It's just so goddamn obvious, and it makes me sick when you see Obama on TV, and he just tries to say this is all about getting rid of a decades-long failed policy. I mean, he is just such a liar, guys. I mean, he does not give a shit about the Cuban people. He does not care about the economy over there. He doesn't care about our economy. He doesn't care about what happens to those workers. He cares about getting donations from Cargill, getting donations from Monsanto, and making sure that his party is still funded and taken care of. And it makes me absolutely sick to see that his lies are not being discerned by more people. Okay? Now, you can see here, Global Research did a ton of articles on this topic. I'm not going to get into all of them. I'm going to be posting the links to these. But you can see that they have a couple different articles. One of them, this came out pretty recently. This was after my article, but the same exact thing. Talking about, the two-track policy to Latin America, Central America, and diplomats to Cuba. So the U.S., again, is sending people back into Latin America. You've probably seen some things about that in the news as well. I don't want to get off topic and start talking about that. But again, making that comparison about how the U.S. has treated countries in Latin America and how they're about to be treating Cuba. It's a great comparison. It's extremely similar, and I'm glad that someone else is making it. Same exact thing here. Cuba between a rock and a hard place in Global Research. Essentially the same point that I was trying to make. The Cuban people are being extorted. They don't have the freedoms that they want right now, but at the same time, the U.S. coming in spells trouble for them, and they're smart enough to know it. So that puts them in an extremely difficult position. This is a pretty lengthy article. I'd recommend you guys check it out. More stuff about new U.S. regulations on trade and travel. So talking about, getting ready to set up the travel industry over to Cuba, things like that. And then an opinion piece on it. So, of course, just like in the Ukraine, you guys probably remember when when everything started popping off in the Ukraine, you had U.S. politicians visiting. You saw Victoria Nuland over there. You saw John McCain over there, essentially setting up the coup. Now we have U.S. senators going over to Cuba. It's essentially the exact same thing. Okay, guys, we have this over here. They're laying the groundwork for the economic takeover. They are laying the groundwork for their NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to further the political goals they have. And be prepared, guys, when you see politicians going into these countries and meeting with people, that makes me think that we might see in Cuba exactly what we saw in Ukraine. And I'm going to get into this a little bit later, but we might see a quote-unquote coup, political coup happen in Cuba at some point due to this. And it might be exactly like Ukraine, where we're sort of told it's an uprising of the people and all that, but then when you look into it for 2 minutes, you find out that it was essentially 100% funded by the U.S. It's not a democratic movement. It's not what the people want, and it really was just a political takeover of a country by the West. That might be exactly what happens here. So I'm not saying it might, turn into a full-on war like it has in the Ukraine. Maybe it will. I don't know. But look for changes happening. Look for not necessarily like an armed revolution, but a political revolution might be coming. Trying to instill some people over there who are more sympathetic to U.S. policy. I'm sure that no matter what, the future leaders of the country will be forced to be sympathetic to U.S. policy, just like in other countries that have to play ball with the U.S., like Saudi Arabia, like a lot of Latin American countries. But at the same time, in Cuba, they might need that in order to make sure that their policies go through. So look for a change in the political climate. Look for some kind of takeover, some kind of hostile takeover of the political system. They're going to call it democracy. They're going to claim it was democracy, and it's going to be nothing about democracy, guys. And at this point, I think we're all starting to realize that quote-unquote democracy is pretty overrated anyway. Hasn't been working out too great for us in the U.S., hasn't been working out too great in the Ukraine, and mostly it's because the term has been bastardized by the politicians of the world at this point. So I would check out, again, that comparison of how politicians might be setting up a new coup in Cuba. So, again, I was talking about the Organipanico earlier, the network of Cuban organic farms. Back to that Boston Globe article. I put it in twice here because you can see that sets up this perfect segue once again. I was talking about those lobbyists coming in, trying to change the political climate, trying to change the situation over there so that people would be more sympathetic to U.S. firms. Look at all these firms listed at the bottom of the article that are going to be coming in here, guys, that are going to be involved. DuPont, Cargill, Monsanto. We've got this bullshit lobbyist organization, U.S. Agricultural Coalition for Cuba. I mean, once again, it just goes to show that these people want to be set up and ready to go so that when they open up offices down there and they have farms going down there and they are essentially raping the Cuban agricultural system, leasing them seeds like they do here in the U.S., when they try to reject it, they're going to have the lawyers in there ready to tie them up. When they try to outvote it, they're going to have the NGOs in there maintaining control over the government. And when anybody tries to make a change, they're going to throw enough money at it to make sure that it doesn't happen. If once you have those firms in there, they are so tied into the U.S. government that they are going to further their own agenda no matter what. And I'm just afraid that a country like Cuba might not have the muscle to fight it off, especially because they're coming out of such a long economic depression. Now, I don't know how many of you know about this, but when you hear about the U.S. and Obama trying to open up these trade restrictions because they're just such good people and it's just time to reverse these decades-long failed policies, you've got to know about what we've been doing behind the scenes, guys. The U.S. has been furthering propaganda campaigns in Cuba for a very, very long time. This goes well beyond, things like Bay of Pigs and all that. Now, a lot of you might not know that the U.S. government was funding an effort called Radio Marti, which was essentially, just like it describes in this article, a plane which flew just back and forth over the island of Cuba, broadcasting like a radio broadcast, obviously Spanish-speaking, which was supposed to sort of subliminally further anti-Castro views, anti-communist views, pro-U.S. views. And honestly, guys, I'm no communist. I'm definitely an ardent non-supporter of communism. But at the same time, this isn't the U.S. being the good guy on the block. This is the U.S. just trying to, again, initiate that coup that I was talking about earlier. And instead of taking a full-on hostile takeover, which is essentially what this opening up of diplomatic relations is, we've got the U.S., again, just trying to make subliminal efforts to have the Cuban people do their dirty work for them. So they had this plane fly over Cuba, broadcasting this propaganda campaign over a radio station. Long story short, the vast majority of the broadcasts don't even make it to the island. The Cuban government actually tries to block it, and apparently they do a pretty good job of it. They are well aware of it. They do try to block the broadcast. So this article essentially talks about why it's a waste of time, and that might be for the most part true, especially because the Cuban people, again, they might not be too, sympathetic to their own government, but they definitely know that the U.S. isn't coming in to be the good guy. I mean, they've seen what the U.S. has done to the rest of the world. Now, that radio broadcast, guys, has its own Wikipedia article, so you can read the background on it. But again, it was just literally a U.S. taxpayer-funded program in which they sent propaganda-ridden radio broadcasts to be broadcasted via a plane into Cuba in order to attempt to further a coup of the government there. And this is all happening for years before this current opening up of diplomatic relations. So again, just trying to show the dubious nature of the U.S.'s motivations in Cuba. I would definitely check this out. Moving on, almost at the end here. Bloomberg, ending the Cuba embargo urged by new agriculture industry coalition. Once again, getting into that whole agricultural lobbying thing. You can see right here, it's the exact same firm they were talking about. So the news is kind of like getting out here, guys. You can see here, president of Chicago Foods International LLC. So all these food companies, all these giant agricultural giants, this is who's coming in, guys. When I was researching this, I was looking for essentially a clue to tell me what industry was taking the lead, and it wasn't hard at all, guys. It was definitely the agricultural industry, companies like Cargill, Monsanto, trying to come in. Okay, it's really not that hard to figure out. I would definitely read these articles more on your own. Another article, outside influences, the farm lobby eyes Cuba. I'm just trying to show you here that the word has gotten out. These guys are putting big money into this, all right? 11 million, mostly poor citizens. Cuba is a good market, but a small market. Let's not talk about the people. Let's not talk about the future. Let's just talk about Cuba as a market, because that's all they are. All they are cattle to these people. They are nothing more than pawns in essentially a game, a chess game that they have set up to extort as much money from this country as possible. And Obama's going to get up there with his gap-toothed grin and tell us that it's for the good of these people because it's a decade-long failed policy. He is a liar. He is a filthy liar, guys, and I'm here to prove it to you. I would check this article out. Two more. This is interesting, guys, getting into Breitbart here. Cuba demands return of Guantanamo, end of U.S. broadcasts in return for diplomacy. Now, this is interesting. This article is from the 1st of July this year. You can see, I was just talking about Radio Marti earlier. Here's the Cuban government saying, guys, back off. Stop trying to take over our country. Everyone knows it. Nobody's hiding it. If you research this for 5 minutes, you'll see that the Cuban government is coming right out in public and saying, we know you guys are doing this. If you want to open up diplomatic relations, you've got to stop. I mean, this is such a joke. We have Obama on TV telling us he's trying to be the good guy, and, a day later, we've got the Cuban government saying, hey, you're trying to take over our country via a messy military and politically financed coup that you're trying to instill by brainwashing our own people. It's just incredible hypocrisy, guys. You've got, on one hand, Obama telling us that he's doing this because he's such a good guy, and on the other hand, we've got the U.S. military spending millions and millions of your dollars flying a plane over Cuba in order to try and take the country over, and they're broadcasting a broadcast that the vast majority of people have blocked because the government knows it's happening. It's a complete waste of money. We might as well just be filling dumpsters with U.S. taxpayer dollars and setting them on fire, because that's what this administration is doing, guys. All right, last one. This, to me, I saw as an interesting article, and this is how I'm going to finish off the video. Cuba, an internet laggard, opens Wi-Fi hotspots across the country. Now, what might be the motivation for things like this? I see a couple different motivations. On the one hand, I think that opening up all these Wi-Fi spots might be actually more in preparation for the U.S. companies and workers. When those people are over there, they're not going to want to deal with this, ancient infrastructure that Cuba has. They're going to need the internet, and maybe this modernization is more for their benefit and their convenience. But the second thing is, if you want to further that US propaganda, if you want to make sure that your propaganda is reaching the masses and reaching the people, the internet is a great way to do it. And the US has tried to do that in many, many different countries. So it's not just radio and TV. Obviously, the US does the same propaganda efforts, just like Radio Marti, on the internet. So, how do you get that message out? Well, if the vast majority of Cubans don't have the internet, if they don't even have potential access to it, then you need to be able to get it to them. So, in order to get the US propaganda message to its people, you need to make sure they have internet access. And I personally think that that is the motivation of this program. The more people that have access to Wi-Fi, the more people that potentially will see the US propaganda that is being posted on the internet. Just like Radio Marti. This might be a way to try to fix the efforts of the Cuban government that is blocking Radio Marti. Perhaps opening up Wi-Fi spots is a way for the US government to try to ensure that their message gets out. So, guys, in conclusion, the Cuba thing is something that I think is going to be a big, big issue coming forward, but I don't think it's going to be talked about. I don't think it's going to be front and center. I think we're going to hear about it from time to time like we have. I don't think it's going to be a full-blown issue, like I said, but it's extremely important. And this is an example for those of us that weren't alive in the 80s to see how an agricultural industry or any other lobbyist comes into a country, influences the political climate, and has the U.S. government come in to do its dirty work. The U.S. tries to initiate coups in countries that won't play ball with its economic policy. The U.S. government spends your tax dollars in order to try to take over countries that it wants to sell products to in order to fund companies that donate to re-election campaigns. They are willing to make a population sick on food that is making our population sick. They are willing to spread GMOs in a country that has largely rejected GMOs. And they are willing to completely initiate a political system that the people there don't want simply for their own profit and personal gain. It's absolutely disgusting, guys, and it's time that we realize what this really is. Obama is not being the good guy. The U.S. government is not the good guy. This is a swindle. It is an economic takeover of an independent nation, and that's what it is. This is the U.S. government waging war, guys. This is a war. Just because we don't have guns being fired and bombs being dropped doesn't mean this isn't a war. This is what an economic war looks like. This is what a political Cold War looks like. That's what this is, guys. Make no mistake about it. If you were there, you would be experiencing the struggles that this is going to cause. And it's their children that are going to be sick on these products when they have to consume Monsanto-ridden food, GMO-ridden food. We do not want these people going in there. It's time that you essentially realize what is going on and try to educate other people about it, guys. Let's talk about Cuba. Let's talk about it with our friends and family. Let's try to discuss the real motivations of what's going on. We have an independent nation 90 miles from our shore that's about to be taken over by our hostile government, and it's time that we explain to other people what is being done in their name with their tax dollars. All right, if you guys have any questions about this or you want to talk about the topic more, hit me up. Really glad I got to do a video on this. And once again, I'm sorry for all the delays and the lack of content. I'm extremely busy moving at the moment. I'm going to try to post more stuff and try to keep in touch. You can always hit me up on Twitter and email and YouTube, guys. So stay in touch. Have a great week.